All right, so today we're going to jump into one of the most incredible real-life adventure stories you'll ever hear. It's all about Herman Melville. Now, you probably know him from Moby Dick, right? But this story, this is what happened to him before all that. This is the tale of a young Melville, a sailor, who basically said, I'm done, jumped ship, and threw himself headfirst into this super remote valley in the South Seas. And, get this valley was home to a tribe with a reputation that would make your blood run cold.
Whoa. Oh, the bloody cannibals. What a meal they'd make of us. I mean, let's just stop and think about that for a second. This is what one of Melville's own crewmates is saying as they're literally sailing past the island where he's about to strand himself. It just perfectly sets the scene, doesn't it? It captures that deep, chilling fear that's just hanging over this whole story. I mean, the stakes? They're about as high as they can possibly get.
So that brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why in the world would anyone, and I mean anyone, choose to risk becoming dinner for a bunch of cannibals? Well, to get that, you've really got to understand the floating nightmare he was so desperate to get away from. An American whaling ship called the Dolly. Yeah, life on the Dolly, it wasn't some grand sailing adventure. No way. It was an absolute nightmare. The conditions were just awful. You had tyrannical officers, anyone who got sick was basically left to rot, and the food? Meager and disgusting. And this wasn't a short trip. They'd already been out there for 6 miserable months with no end in sight. The ship itself was literally falling to pieces, covered in barnacles. It was just this soul-crushing, miserable way to live. So, faced with all that, Melville basically came to a conclusion. Anything, and I mean anything, had to be better than one more day on that ship. He figured he'd rather take his chances with the people they called savages. And you know, he wasn't the only one feeling that desperate. Another sailor, a guy named Typee, he was right there with him, ready to make the same incredibly risky jump. So what was the big escape plan? Well, it was dangerously simple, almost stupidly simple. They didn't have maps, no real gear, nothing. The whole idea was to just wait for a holiday when some of the crew would be off duty, snatch a few stale biscuits, and just make a run for it. They were going to disappear into the thick mountains of the island and just, hope it all worked out. This was a total shot in the dark. Yeah, that shot in the dark quickly turned into a brutal, grueling ordeal. They spent days stumbling through this wild, untamed jungle, getting weaker and more starved by the hour. And then, finally, they came face to face with the very people they were terrified of, the Typee. And their journey through those mountains was just brutal. It wasn't a path, it was a tangled, confusing mess of jungle. For days, they were completely lost, starving, just getting beaten down by the elements. It got so bad, Melville actually wrote that the idea of turning back and going back to the ship was worse than anything. It was totally unendurable. So, pushing forward into the valley of the reputed cannibals, that was pretty much their only option. So just try to picture this, right? You've got these 2 exhausted, starving sailors, and they finally stumble down into this beautiful green valley. They're probably expecting to be met with spears and yelling, but that's not what happens at all. Instead of being attacked, they're met with, well, curiosity. The Typee people just kind of surround them, looking at them, but there's no real aggression. It's strange. And that's when they meet the chief, a man named Mehevi. Melville describes him as this just magnificent warrior, a true nobleman of nature. The Typees are absolutely fascinated by Melville and Typee. The thing they're most interested in, their white skin. They're touching it, examining it like it's some kind of strange cloth. The whole reception is just so disarmingly friendly. It's the complete opposite of their terrifying, bloodthirsty reputation. And this right here is where the story gets really, really interesting, because Melville starts to realize he's basically stumbled into a kind of paradise. The valley is stunning, the people seem so happy and carefree, but there's this constant nagging feeling of dread just under the surface of it all. I mean, in so many ways, life in his valley was, well, perfect. Melville points out there's no money, no mortgages, no bills to pay, no courts, no police. Food is everywhere, just growing on trees. The people are gorgeous and healthy. Life is just this string of easy, beautiful days. He even makes friends with this lovely young woman, Fayaway. It really is like a utopia. But utopias always have a dark side, don't they? And then, bam! You get a moment just like this one. One of the Typee guys is telling Melville about their enemies from a neighboring tribe. And to show what those enemies would do to him, he just casually grabs Melville's arm and bites it. Now, it's meant as like a friendly warning, but can you imagine? The implication is absolutely terrifying. It confirms, right then and there, that cannibalism isn't just some scary story they tell sailors, it's real. And just as that horrible reality is starting to sink in, his one and only friend, his only connection back to his old life, Toby, just vanishes. He leaves the valley, supposedly to find medicine for an injury he has, and he swears he'll be back in 3 days. But 3 days comes and goes, a week goes by, then another, and the hope just trains away. Melville is now completely and utterly alone, surrounded by these friendly, smiling people who might, want to eat him. So this is where things get really psychologically twisted. Melville is plunged into this kind of torment that's really hard to wrap your head around. See, he's not locked in a dungeon. He's living in a paradise. No one is torturing him. In fact, they're showering him with kindness. And that's exactly what makes it so unbearable. And this right here really breaks down that dilemma perfectly. On the one hand, they're the perfect hosts. They give him food, a place to live. He even gets a personal attendant, a guy named Corey. They treat him like an honored guest. But, on the other hand, he is absolutely forbidden to leave the valley. Not a chance. He's under this constant smiling surveillance. So what are they? Are they his hosts or his captors? Every single nice thing they do could be genuine, or it could just be them, fattening him up for the main course. Then comes the ultimate test. They insist that he accept their greatest honor, getting a facial tattoo. For the Typee, this is a huge deal. It's a sacred mark that says you are one of us. But for Melville, it is a horrifying idea. I mean, to have your face tattooed would be to be marked forever as one of them. It's a permanent brand. It's a sign that you could never, ever go back to your old life. It was a line in the sand that he was desperate not to cross. So you can just imagine the psychological pressure just building and building. He's living in what looks like this beautiful, perfect society, but in his own head, he's trapped in a prison of constant fear and suspicion. And this whole experience, it just forces him to question literally everything he thought he knew about civilization and the world. And that leads him to one of the most powerful ideas in the whole book. He starts comparing the two worlds. He looks at the peaceful, surprisingly harmonious life of the Typee, and then he thinks about the cruelty, the misery, the sheer awfulness of the so-called civilized world he just escaped from on the ship Dolly. And it forces him to ask this really uncomfortable question. Who are the real savages here? Is it the cannibals who live in relative peace, or is it the enlightened sailors who create these floating hells of tyranny and abuse? So it all boils down to this, really. Melville had everything you could possibly want for a comfortable life. He had no worries about money or food. He was safe from all the hardships of the world he knew. He was even admired by the people around him. But the one thing he didn't have, the one thing he wanted more than anything else, was freedom. Simple as that. The freedom to make his own choices, and most importantly, the freedom to leave. And that leaves us with the huge central question of this whole incredible story. And it's a question that's just as important now as it was back then. What really is paradise? I mean, if you have all the comfort, all the safety, a real sense of community, but you don't have freedom, are you actually free? Or are you just trapped in a much, much more beautiful prison? It's the kind of thought that really sticks with you long after you've heard the end of the tale.